cold reckoning. He didn't scream when they branded his cheek with the mark of the dishonored. He didn't weep when they stripped him of his armor, piece by piece, before the entire court. Every rivet, every pauldron, every buckle hitting the stone floor like the tolling of a funeral bell. He didn't even flinch when the woman he loved turned her face away. Sir Aldric of Varenhold simply looked at the man who had destroyed him, his oldest friend, his sworn brother, the most celebrated knight in the kingdom. And he made a promise, not with words, not with tears, with silence. And in the kingdoms of the medieval world, there was nothing more terrifying than a man who had lost everything and chosen, instead of despair, to wait. This is not a story about honor. This is not a story about glory. This is a story about what lives inside a man after honor and glory have been taken from him, and what he becomes when the time finally comes to collect. This is The Iron Debt. Part 1, The Brotherhood of Iron. Chapter 1, Two Sons of the Same Storm. The kingdom of Varenhold sat between two rivers and a lie. Its eastern border kissed the Greyvale River, cold and narrow, good for fishing, and little else. Its western border followed the Thornwall, wide, dark, and treacherous, with hidden currents that had swallowed more than one ambitious invader. And at its heart, like a rot hidden beneath gold-painted stone, sat the lie that held it all together, the belief that its king, Aldric the Steadfast, had earned his throne through valor. He hadn't, but that is a different story. This one begins with two boys. Aldric and Kaelin were not brothers by blood. They were something rarer, brothers by circumstance, forged in the same fire. They had grown up together in the household of Lord Brennan of Ashford, a minor vassal to the crown, whose greatest contributions to the kingdom were his stables and his loyalty. Both boys had arrived at his gates within a single season of each other. Aldric at 7, the second son of a disgraced minor knight with nothing to offer but a child he could not feed. Kaelin at 8, a war orphan found on the road from the burning village of Kelmore, clutching a broken sword hilt like a holy relic. Lord Brennan had taken them both. He was that kind of man. Together they trained. Together they bled. Together they learned the 3 pillars of knighthood, as Lord Brennan's aging master-at-arms drilled into their skulls every morning before dawn: loyalty, valor, restraint. Aldric took to the sword like water finding its level, naturally, inevitably, without drama. He was not flashy. He was not fast. But he was relentless in a way that unnerved men twice his size, a quality that would one day make him both legendary and hated. Kaelin was something else entirely. Where Aldric was stone, Kaelin was fire. He moved through combat like a song, beautiful, unpredictable, and impossible to ignore. He had the face of a young priest and the instincts of a predator, and from the moment he first lifted a blade, everyone who watched him knew that this boy was going somewhere extraordinary. The tragedy was that he knew it too. They were knighted together at 18, both on their knees before Lord Brennan on a cold autumn morning, the old lord's sword resting briefly on each shoulder, with the same weight, the same words, the same solemnity. Aldric wept silently. Kaelin smiled. And for a time, a golden, irretrievable time, they were everything the songs promised brotherhood could be. Chapter 2, The War of the Thornwall. Chapter 2, The War of the Thornwall. In the 4th year of King Aldric's reign, the Lord of Morn, a powerful western warlord named Dreveth the Black, launched an invasion across the Thornwall with 3,000 soldiers and a grudge that had been fermenting for a decade. Dreveth believed, not without reason, that Aldric had stolen land that rightfully belonged to his family during the chaos of the previous king's death. He had spent years building his army. He had spent years waiting for weakness. He chose poorly. Because that winter, riding under Lord Brennan's banner, were Aldric and Kaelin. The campaign lasted 8 months and broke the bones of both sides. Aldric distinguished himself in the Battle of Crossford, where he held a bridge for 6 hours with 11 men against a force of 200, buying enough time for the main Varenhold army to regroup. 6 of his 11 men died. Aldric took wounds to his shoulder, his thigh, and his left hand, losing the tip of his smallest finger to a Moornish axe. He never mentioned the wounds, he never mentioned the dead. He asked only whether the bridge had held. It had. Kaelin's moment came later, and it was more spectacular in the way that fire is more spectacular than stone. At the final battle outside the fortress of Dravath's own keep, with the outcome hanging by a thread, Kaelin broke through the enemy's flank with 30 cavalry and personally unhorsed Dravath's champion, a giant of a man named Gorvek, who had not been beaten in single combat in 11 years. The fight lasted less than 4 minutes. Kaelin emerged without a scratch. The army erupted. King Edric, watching from the ridge with his advisors, turned to his steward and asked for the young knight's name. Within a fortnight, Kaelin of Ashford had been elevated to the King's Own, the elite brotherhood of 12 knights who served as the monarch's personal guard, his enforcers, and in times of ceremony, the living symbols of Varenhold's martial glory. Within a month, he had been given a seat at the high table. Aldric was given a commendation and a small land grant on the eastern border. Good soil, fair weather, and very far from the capital. "We'll send for you soon," Kaelin told him at the parting, clasping his arm with the old strength of brothers. "I'll speak to the king. This is temporary." Aldric smiled. "Take care of yourself." When have I ever not? They didn't know it was the last time they would speak as equals. Chapter 3. The Lady of the Silver Tower. Chapter 3. The Lady of the Silver Tower. In the songs they would eventually write about this story, and they would write many songs, though most would get the details wrong. She was either a saint or a serpent, depending on who was doing the singing. The truth, as truth usually does, refused such clean categories. Isolde was the eldest daughter of Count Renfeld of Silvervast, a powerful eastern lord whose strategic position made him invaluable to the crown, and whose personal morality made him someone you never turned your back on. She had been raised in a tower, not metaphorically, but literally, in a high stone tower overlooking the Greyvale River. Educated by scholars, trained in diplomacy, and groomed from childhood to be a political instrument. She was also, by every account, one of the most magnetic people who had ever drawn breath in Varenhold. Aldric met her first. It was during a minor diplomatic mission, barely worthy of his station, but he had been asked to escort a trade delegation to Silvervast, and he obeyed, as he always obeyed, completely and without complaint. Isolde had been tasked by her father to host a delegation for 2 days, and on the first evening, she had sat across a long table from Aldric and asked him, with the directness of someone utterly unafraid, what it was like to hold a bridge for 6 hours knowing you might die. He had never been asked that before. He had answered, honestly, for the first time, about the cold. About how fear eventually becomes something else when it lasts long enough. Not courage exactly, but a kind of terrible calm. About how he had thought, in the 6th hour, not of glory or duty or the king's banner, but of the smell of bread baking in the kitchen at Ashford. Isolde had listened to every word. That, she said, when he finished, is what the songs never capture. He came back to Silvervast 3 times over the following year, each time with official reason. Each time he stayed longer than duty required. By the time Kaelin arrived, summoned to Silvervast by the king as part of the preliminary negotiations for an alliance through marriage, it was already too late for anyone's plans to proceed cleanly. Aldric loved Isolde. Isolde, for reasons she had examined carefully and found impossible to argue with, loved him back. What neither of them knew was that the king had already decided. Isolde would marry a member of the King's Own, cementing the alliance with Silvervast and anchoring Renfeld's loyalty permanently to the crown. And the king had chosen Kaelin. Part 2. The Fracture. Chapter 4. The Feast of the New Alliance. The feast was held in the great hall of Varenhold's capital, Irongate, in the first week of spring. Aldric attended as lord of his small eastern holdings. A minor title, a polite invitation, barely significant. He was seated near the middle of the long tables, far from the high platform where Kaelin sat at the king's right hand, resplendent in silver and black armor, bearing the king's own insignia. Exiled arrived late. She wore deep green, a choice that was either deliberate or somehow instinctive, because green was the color of Aldric's house banner, the only thing he had inherited from his disgraced father that he had chosen to keep. She saw him across the hall before she saw Kaelin, and in the span of 3 heartbeats an entire conversation passed between them that neither would ever be able to fully describe. Then she was guided to her seat beside Kaelin, and the feast began, and the announcements were made, and Aldric sat very still in the middle of a room full of noise, and ate nothing. Kaelin found them after, in the courtyard. "I didn't know," Kaelin said. It was the closest thing to an apology he was capable of in those days. "I didn't know," Kaelin said. It was the closest thing to an apology he was capable of in those days. "Yes. Then it's decided. Aldric, I said it's decided." He turned to look at his oldest friend, and his face was entirely composed, which somehow made it worse. "She will be safe with you. You're the best fighter I know. You'll honor her father's alliance. You'll do well." Kaelin stared at him for a long moment. "You're going to hate me," he said quietly. "Eventually." "No," Aldric said, and in that moment he meant it. "I'm going to be your sworn brother until one of us dies." That was decided long before any of this. He went back inside and drank steadily and systematically until the hall stopped looking like the ruins of something precious. Chapter 5. The Marriage and the Secret. Chapter 5. The Marriage and the Secret. Aldric stood as witness. What was not known, what could not be known, because only 2 people in the world carried the knowledge, was that Isolde and Aldric had met one final time, alone, the night before the ceremony. She had come to his room. Not, she would insist to herself in the years that followed, with any intention of doing something irreversible. She had come to say what needed saying before the door between them closed forever. She had come to be honest, one last time, with someone who had always deserved her honesty. What happened was not planned. What happened was the collision of 2 people saying goodbye to something they had never been allowed to call by its true name. By morning, Isolde returned to her chamber. She was married 6 hours later. Aldric rode east the next day, back to his fields and his river and his small, quiet life, carrying something inside him that he had no words for and no right to keep. Neither of them spoke of it. Neither of them would. Neither of them would. Chapter 6. The Heir and the Doubt. The child was born in the 3rd year of the marriage. A boy. Dark-haired, gray-eyed, healthy. Named Rowan by Kaelin, who stood in the receiving room with the uncomplicated joy of a man who had never had reason to question what was his. A boy. Dark-haired, gray-eyed, healthy. Named Rowan by Kaelin, who stood in the receiving room with the uncomplicated joy of a man who had never had reason to question what was his. She told herself it meant nothing. Eye color was uncertain. Ancestry was complex. Doubt was a poison. She told herself this for a year. Then she sent a letter east. Aldric read it by firelight in his hall, alone, and sat for a very long time in the dark before he wrote back. His reply said, "He is Kaelin's son. I am certain of this. Do not carry what was never meant to be carried." It was a lie. He was not certain, but it was the right lie, and he chose it deliberately, and he went on choosing it for another 3 years while the boy grew and the gray eyes remained. He should have burned both letters. He didn't. In the 6th year of his marriage, Kaelin was sent north. A rebellion had erupted in the Highland territories, petty lords refusing taxation, border clans raiding settled villages, the usual cocktail of poverty and pride that produced violence in predictable seasons. The king sent 300 soldiers and his best knight to put an end to it. Cailan was gone for 11 months. In his absence, the management of his affairs in Iron Gate fell partially to his household steward, and partially by the king's arrangement. To the man the king had begun to rely on more and more as a quiet resolver of complications, Aldric, who had been called to the capital in a new administrative capacity, given a proper title, and given chambers in the castle itself. It was an honor. It was also, for a man of Aldric's specific history, a form of exquisite suffering. He did his duty. He managed Cailan's affairs with scrupulous fairness. He saw Isolde in passing, at meals, at court functions, in the corridors of the castle, with a formality so precise it must have looked, to outside observers, like simple professionalism. What it actually was the most sustained act of will Aldric had ever performed. Then Cailan came back. The victory had been total, the rebellion crushed, and Cailan returned to Iron Gate in the full blaze of his reputation, celebrated, decorated, and carrying the particular restlessness of a man who had been living at his best for a year and was not quite ready to come down from it. He embraced Aldric first, before his wife, an old habit. He embraced Aldric first, before his wife, an old habit. "You kept my house in order," he said. Something in Cailan's eyes shifted, briefly. Reading Aldric had always been difficult, but Cailan was the one person who'd had 30 years of practice. He studied his oldest friend's face and found nothing, which was itself, perhaps, a kind of answer. He went to greet his wife and his son. That night, he found the letters. Part 3, The Betrayal. Part 3, The Betrayal. He hadn't been looking for them. He had been searching his study for a campaign record he needed for the debriefing with the King's Council, a document he had apparently filed before leaving and couldn't now locate. It was in the third drawer, under a locked box he had forgotten contained old correspondence. The box wasn't locked anymore. He didn't know when it had been opened. He didn't know who had been in his study. He pulled out the campaign record, and then, because the letter beneath it was clearly not from his campaign, he looked at it. Isolde's handwriting, addressed to Aldric's estate in the east, dated 3 years prior. "He has your eyes. I don't know what to do with that." Then Aldric's response. "He is Cailan's son. I am certain of this. Do not carry what was never meant to be carried." Cailan sat in his study for a very long time. When he emerged, his face was pleasant, his voice was steady. He ate dinner with his family, complimented his son on his growing skill with a practice sword, kissed his wife goodnight, and retired early with claims of fatigue from the road. He did not sleep. He did not sleep. It was the wrong decision, and part of him knew it even then. But Cailan had always been fire, and fire does not deliberate. Chapter 9, The Construction of a Lie. What Cailan built over the following 6 weeks was a masterpiece of targeted destruction. He didn't confront Aldric, he didn't confront Isolde. He was far too clever for that, and far too proud to expose his own wound publicly before he'd aimed the wound at someone else. Instead, he worked. He had connections in the king's intelligence apparatus. Men who owed him, men who admired him, men who feared him. He used all 3 categories. He began planting evidence, a falsified letter, supposedly intercepted, in which Aldric appeared to be in communication with the remnants of Dreveth's faction in the west. A merchant, properly compensated, who claimed to have carried correspondence between Aldric and a known exile. An anonymous testimony that Aldric had met privately with a Moorish agent during his diplomatic travels. None of it was true. All of it was constructed with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years watching how power worked in Varenhold. Then he brought it to the king. Chapter 10, The Trial of the Accused. The charges were read on a Tuesday morning in the Great Hall. Treason. communication with enemies of the crown, conspiracy to undermine the king's alliance with Silvervast. Aldric stood in the center of the hall and listened to each charge with the expression of a man who had been struck by something he did not recognize, because he hadn't. He knew the game, but he hadn't known anyone was playing it. He looked at Kaelin, standing to the king's right, face composed and grave, the picture of a reluctant witness fulfilling a painful duty. And he understood. Not completely, not the letters, not the full architecture of the betrayal, not the specific material Kaelin had used, but the essential fact that this had been done to him deliberately by the man he trusted above all others, for reasons he could guess at and wished he couldn't. The trial lasted 2 days. In those days, the outcome was understood before the evidence was heard. When the King's Own initiated the charges, the evidence was not the point. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, stripping of title, lands, and knighthood, banishment from Varenhold, the brand of the dishonored seared into his left cheek. He didn't scream. He made his promise to the cold air, to no one, to everyone. He waited.